My name is Marcia Johnson, and I am 60 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened just 3 days ago in the hills outside Richmond, Virginia, and it will forever change the way you think about family. That morning, I stood on the side of the Blue Ridge Parkway, my body trembling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My husband, Zeke, lay broken beside me. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. Just above us, my son Darius and his wife Monique whispered frantically, believing we were already gone. "Stay still, Marcia," Zeke gasped, his voice barely a breath. "Play dead." And so I did. I lay there, my face pressed against the cold dirt, praying that my shaking body would not betray me. My own child had just tried to kill me, and as if that wasn't enough, what Zeke confessed in that moment shattered me more than the fall itself. He revealed a truth he had kept hidden for 25 years. The truth about my firstborn, Isaiah. Until that instant, I had lived with the memory of Isaiah's death as a tragic accident. I had cried myself to sleep for years, believing he had stumbled on a bridge one October night long ago. But Zeke's words made me realize something far darker. Isaiah hadn't fallen. He had been pushed by his own brother. The sound of that secret echoed louder than the roar of the wind rushing through the canyon. My world collapsed in a way I can hardly explain. Everything I thought I knew about my family, everything I believed about love, loyalty, and blood ties, it all disintegrated in that single breath. This story is not just about betrayal. It is about how a family, built on church Sundays, homemade dinners, and the warm laughter of children playing in the yard, can hide the darkest sins. It is about how I, an ordinary woman from Virginia, came to lie broken at the bottom of a mountain, listening to the whispers of the son I once cradled in my arms, plotting my death. And if you think this sounds like the end, let me assure you, it is only the beginning. Before that day on the mountain, if you had asked anyone in Richmond about my husband and me, they would have told you we were the picture of a good, steady marriage. Ezekiel Johnson, though everyone called him Zeke, was the kind of man you could count on. His hands were rough from years in his carpentry shop, but they were also gentle enough to rock a newborn baby to sleep. For 40 years, Zeke had been my partner in everything. He still brought me fresh-cut flowers from the roadside whenever he came home from work. He held the door open for me at church on Sunday mornings. He teased me when I burned biscuits, and he always insisted on washing the dishes after dinner, because he knew I hated it. We had carved out a life together in a modest brick house on the south side of Richmond. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, filled with the sound of gospel music on Saturday mornings and the smell of collard greens simmering on the stove. Neighbors would wave when we sat out on the porch in the evenings, sipping sweet tea while the sun dipped low. People saw us and thought, that's what love looks like. They didn't see the nights Zeke and I whispered our fears in the dark, wondering why our youngest son seemed so restless, so different from his brother. They didn't see the shadows creeping at the edges of our family, long before the day those shadows swallowed us whole. Looking back now, I realize Zeke and I weren't just building a home. We were building the stage where tragedy would one day play out. We raised 2 sons under that roof, Isaiah and Darius. They couldn't have been more different. Isaiah, our firstborn, carried light wherever he went. He was the kind of boy who filled the house with laughter, who offered to mow Mrs. Carter's lawn next door without ever asking for a dime. Teachers loved him, the church choir adored him, and even as a child, He dreamed big. He talked about studying engineering at Virginia Tech, about building bridges that would connect cities and people. When I looked at Isaiah, I saw the future, the kind of man any mother would be proud to call her son. Darius, 5 years younger, was another story. He was quiet, reserved, always watching from the corners of the room while his brother shined in the spotlight. I tried to tell myself it was just his nature, that not every child needed to be outgoing. But sometimes, when I caught him staring at Isaiah with an expression I couldn't quite name, a chill would slide down my spine. Still, as a mother, you don't play favorites. You tell yourself you love them equally, and I believed I did. On Sundays after church, Isaiah would sit at the table sharing his latest plans, while Darius barely touched his plate, lost in his own thoughts. Zeke would pat my hand and whisper, "Don't worry, he'll find his way." But even back then, something deep inside me wondered if he already had, and whether that path was leading us all somewhere dark. Sundays were the heartbeat of our home. After church, our family would gather around the old oak table Zeke had built with his own hands. Aunt Gloria and Aunt Ruth would bring sweet potato pie and cornbread. Cousins would run through the yard chasing one another, and the house would swell with gospel music, laughter, and the smell of fried chicken sizzling in cast iron. For me, those moments were everything. They were proof that love could be carved out of ordinary days, that we were part of something bigger than ourselves, a Black family rooted in faith, tradition, and community. I believed those gatherings were the foundation that would hold us steady through anything. What I didn't know then was that behind the smiles and hymns, shadows had already crept in. My youngest son sat at that same table, silent and brooding, his fork scraping against the plate, while everyone else laughed. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just tired or shy. But now, looking back, I understand. Even in those golden Sundays, the seeds of betrayal were already being sown. By the time Isaiah turned 20, the whole neighborhood had their eyes on him. He wasn't just our son. He was a young man everyone believed was destined for greatness. He had earned a scholarship to Virginia Tech, and when he came home on weekends, he'd sit in the living room sketching blueprints for bridges and buildings that, in his mind, would reshape our city. I still remember him sitting cross-legged on the floor, papers scattered around, his pencil moving faster than his words. "Mama," he told me one evening, "I don't just want to build things. I want to build something that lasts, something people can lean on." To me, Isaiah was more than a dreamer. He was a doer. He tutored kids from church who struggled with math, helped his father repair porches for neighbors who couldn't afford to pay, and he never complained. His spirit was bright, almost too bright. And maybe that was the problem. His light didn't just shine, it cast shadows. And in those shadows stood his younger brother Darius, watching, waiting, and carrying a resentment none of us fully saw. Back then, I believed Isaiah's future stretched wide open, like the bridges he dreamed of. I couldn't have imagined that in a single night, all those dreams would be snatched away, pushed over the edge, not by fate, but by blood. It was around that same time the tension between my sons began to boil over. At first, it was little things, arguments about chores, or who would take the car on Friday night. But as Isaiah grew into a man with plans and ambition, the gap between him and Darius widened like a fault line. I'd catch them whispering in the hallway, their voices sharp, breaking off the moment I walked into the room. Sometimes I'd hear Isaiah's voice raised, full of frustration, and Darius's lower, bitter, like a storm rumbling just out of sight. One evening, Isaiah came home furious. His fists were clenched, his jaw tight. "Mama," he said, "Darius is into things he shouldn't be. Money, friends I don't trust, lies." He wouldn't give me details, but his eyes told me he was carrying a burden too heavy for his young shoulders. Darius, on the other hand, grew colder. At dinner, while Isaiah shared stories about school and the future, Darius barely touched his plate, staring down at his food with that quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. Zeke tried to smooth it over, telling me, "Boys fight, Marcia. They'll grow out of it." But a mother knows. Their fights weren't about chores or cars anymore. They were about something deeper, darker, something that would soon rip our family apart. It was an October night, cool and sharp, the kind where the air feels alive with change. I remember because the leaves in Richmond had just turned, painting the streets gold and crimson. That was the night Isaiah never came home. Zeke and I waited at the kitchen table long after midnight. The clock ticked. The coffee turned cold, and every passing minute stretched heavier across my chest. Finally, around dawn, word came from the police. They had found Isaiah's body near the old Manchester Bridge over the James River. The officers said it was an accident. Maybe he had slipped. Maybe he had leaned too far over the railing. They spoke in calm, professional tones, but their words landed like knives. I wanted to scream at them. Isaiah wasn't careless. He wasn't reckless. He was careful, thoughtful, steady. The story didn't fit, but I was too broken to fight it. At the funeral, I wore the same black dress I had worn to my mother's service years before, our church filled to the brim. Friends, neighbors, classmates, all grieving the young man who had carried so much promise. People sang hymns with voices cracked by sorrow, and I cried until my body shook. Darius sat in the front pew beside us, his face unreadable. No tears, no trembling hands, just a calm that unsettled me in ways I couldn't name. He hugged me after the burial, whispering, "We'll get through this, Mama." But even then, something in his voice felt hollow, rehearsed. For years, I told myself it was grief. That was the only way I could make sense of his coldness. But now, after all I've learned, I know better. That night on the bridge wasn't fate. It was blood. My younger son had pushed my firstborn into the dark waters of the James, and my husband had carried that secret alone for 25 years. Isaiah's funeral was the darkest day of my life. The sanctuary was draped in white lilies, the air thick with the sound of sobbing, and yet I felt as though I were moving through a dream I couldn't wake from. People came up to me with words of comfort. "He's in a better place. God needed another angel." But none of it touched the raw wound inside me. My boy was gone, and nothing could fill that emptiness. What haunts me most from that day isn't just the hymns or the weight of the casket lowering into the ground. It's the way Darius stood there, still and composed, as though the world hadn't just collapsed around us. His silence unnerved me. No tears stained his cheeks, no trembling in his voice when he said goodbye. At the time, I convinced myself he was simply grieving differently. Children process loss in their own ways, I told myself. But now, with the truth laid bare, I understand that calm for what it was. Not grief, not shock. It was the cold mask of someone who already knew how Isaiah had died, Life in Virginia had once felt ordinary, even beautiful in its simplicity. Our days were steady, built on small routines that gave meaning to our years. I taught at the local elementary school, where children's laughter echoed in the hallways, and little hands tugged at my sleeves with questions. Zeke ran his small carpentry shop downtown, turning rough timber into furniture that seemed to carry part of his soul. His hands were strong, but his touch was always gentle when shaping wood. We raised 2 sons in that city. First came Richard. 5 years later, Darius. Richard was the light of our home, the kind of boy who filled every room with laughter. He worked alongside his father, carrying lumber twice his size, and still managed to protect me with a smile when life grew heavy. Darius, though quieter, was no less loved. I thought I loved them equally, as a mother should. Sundays were our sacred ritual. Church in the morning, then dinner at the oak table Zeke had carved himself. Richard would share his dreams of becoming an engineer, while Darius often picked at his food, lost in silence. Yet I believed our family was whole, safe, and blessed. Those years felt like the foundation of a future we could trust. Grandchildren running in the yard, growing old in the same house where we raised our boys. I had no reason to suspect that beneath this picture of harmony, shadows were already growing. When Richard turned 20, something in our household shifted, almost like a crack, forming in glass too fine to see at first. The brothers, who had once played side by side, began to clash in ways I couldn't understand. I would catch their voices rising late at night, whispers that stopped the second I entered the hallway. Zeke dismissed it as brotherly squabbles, telling me it was normal, that boys would be boys. But I felt something heavier in the air. Richard carried himself with determination, his dreams taking shape as he planned for college and a career. Darius, by contrast, grew restless. His silence at the dinner table became sharper, his eyes darker. Then came the night Richard didn't come home. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, waiting for his footsteps. Midnight passed, then 2, then 3. My chest tightened with a dread I couldn't name. When neighbors joined Zeke in searching the town, I stayed behind, clinging to hope. By dawn, they found him, his body at the bottom of the river gorge. The police called it an accident, a misstep in the dark. I wanted desperately to believe them, to believe fate had been cruel, not that something unthinkable had taken my boy from me. But the silence in Darius's eyes at Richard's funeral told me otherwise. A silence I didn't yet understand, but one that chilled me to my bones. Not long after the wedding, Darius announced he was starting his own carpentry business. He said he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, to build something with his hands, the way Zeke had done for decades. At first, I felt proud. Maybe this was the redemption we'd been waiting for. The boy who once drifted in Isaiah's shadow, finally stepping into his own light. He rented a small shop on the edge of Richmond and filled it with shiny new tools. He talked about custom furniture, high-end cabinetry, and how his work would one day rival the best in Virginia. Monique stood beside him at every step, her smile wide, her words sweet, telling anyone who'd listen that her husband was destined for success. But cracks began to show. Payments were late, suppliers complained, and whispers reached us through neighbors. Darius wasn't keeping up. At family dinners, he brushed off our questions with charm, but his eyes carried a restlessness I recognized. Later, I would learn the truth. The business was never as successful as he claimed. Behind the polished shop windows and the big talk, Darius was drowning in debt, gambling on sports, borrowing from the wrong people in Norfolk, taking risks that spiraled out of control. He wore his father's trade like a mask, a way to hide the chaos beneath. And Monique, instead of steering him back toward the light, tightened the mask, polishing the image of a man who was already sinking. If you asked folks around Richmond back then, they would have told you Darius was a model husband and father. He showed up to church every Sunday with Monique at his side, their 2 children dressed in pressed shirts and polished shoes. He sang hymns with a hand lifted high, bowed his head in prayer, and shook the pastor's hand with the confidence of a man at peace. At block parties, he grilled burgers for the neighbors and laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. When one of the elders needed a wheelchair ramp, he was the first to volunteer his tools and his time. People praised him to me constantly. "Marcia, you must be so proud. That boy of yours turned out just right." And I smiled, because that's what mothers do. I smiled even as something inside me stirred with unease. The truth was, Darius knew how to play the part. He carried his children on his shoulders, called Monique my queen in public, and wrapped his arm around me when we posed for church photos. But I could feel the performance in it, the calculated way he made sure the community saw a man who had overcome tragedy, a son who had grown strong after his brother's death. In reality, he wasn't building a family. He was building a facade, brick by brick, hiding the rot beneath. And I, desperate to believe in redemption, let myself mistake that mask for the real thing. It was about 6 months ago when the first crack split through the mask. Zeke and I had decided it was time to update our will. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but after 40 years of working hard, my years teaching at the elementary school, Zeke's carpentry, and the small inheritance I'd received from my parents, we had managed to save close to $200,000. Add to that our brick house on the south side of Richmond and a little piece of land in Amelia County, and we had something worth leaving behind. When we told Darius and Monique about our plans, their reaction was unexpected. Instead of the casual nod or quiet gratitude I might have expected, Darius leaned forward, eager, his smile too wide. "Mama, Daddy, that's smart," he said, tapping the table with his finger. "Y'all need to make sure everything's in order. Life's unpredictable." Monique chimed in quickly, her voice smooth as honey. "You know we'll always be here for you. It only makes sense for us to handle the estate directly. We'll make sure the grandbabies are taken care of." She reached across the table, resting her manicured hand over mine, the gesture warm on the surface, but sending a chill straight through me. I remember glancing at Zeke. He nodded, half convinced, always the more trusting one between us. But my stomach twisted. Isaiah had once promised he'd look after us in our old age, that he'd make sure we were comfortable. Now, with him gone, Darius was all we had left. What choice did we really have? A week later, we sat in a lawyer's office downtown, signing papers that named Darius and Monique our sole heirs. The ink barely dried before Monique leaned over and whispered, "Now, we're officially one family forever." She smiled as though it were a blessing, but to me, it felt like a threat. Not long after the will was signed, Darius and Monique started showing up at our house more often. At first, I told myself it was a blessing. What parent wouldn't want their children to visit? But these visits weren't about family. They were about business. "Daddy," Darius said one Saturday morning, looking around our living room with narrowed eyes. "This house is too big for y'all now. 2 stories. All these stairs. What if Mama falls? You should sell while the market's high and move into something smaller, easier to manage." Monique sat beside me, stroking my hand as if she were comforting me. "We just want what's best for you, Mama. Imagine a cozy condo in the city. No yard work, no maintenance. You could use the extra money to enjoy life. Maybe even take a trip." Her words dripped with sweetness, but her eyes scanned the room like an appraiser. Zeke, ever the practical one, began nodding. "They might have a point, Marcia," he murmured later that night. But I couldn't shake the unease. Every corner of that house held our history. Isaiah's laughter, the smell of Sunday dinners, Zeke's hand-carved furniture. To sell it felt like erasing our lives. Still, their pressure didn't stop. They brought up life insurance, power of attorney, investments we'd never considered. Always smiling, always presenting their ideas as if it were love speaking. But in my gut, I knew it wasn't love at all. It was calculation. One night, after yet another tense visit from Darius and Monique, I finally spoke my fears aloud. As I washed dishes at the sink, I turned to Zeke and asked, "Don't you think it's strange? The way they're always talking about our money, our future?" Zeke set down his glass slowly, his shoulders heavy. For a long time, he didn't answer. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, his hands pressed against his face, as though he was holding back years of weight. "Marcia," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "There's something I never told you, about Isaiah." The room seemed to tilt. My heart thudded so loudly I could barely hear him. "That night," Zeke whispered, "Darius wasn't in his room like he claimed. I followed him. I saw them at the bridge. They were shouting, Isaiah waving papers in Darius's face. Bank statements, proof that Darius had been stealing from our savings. Isaiah threatened to tell us everything." Zeke's eyes glistened with tears he had held back for 25 years. "And then, Marcia, Darius pushed him. It wasn't an accident." I dropped the dish in my hand. The shatter on the floor was nothing compared to the shatter inside me all these years. I had lived with grief, believing my son's death was fate. But it wasn't. It was blood. And the truth had been sitting in silence beside me every night for a quarter-century. Just days after Zeke's confession, the phone rang. It was Darius, his voice sweet as syrup. "Mama, Daddy, we were thinking it'd be beautiful to celebrate your 40th anniversary with something special. How about a family hike up in the Blue Ridge this weekend? We'll take pictures. Make a whole day of it." Zeke and I locked eyes across the kitchen table. We both heard the same thing beneath his words. An invitation to our own execution. I forced a smile into my voice. "That sounds nice, son. Let us think about it." But the moment I hung up, my hands began to shake. The next day, Monique arrived with grocery bags filled with trail mix, bottled water, and a brand new camera. She hugged me tight, whispering, "These memories will last forever." The words slid down my spine like ice. That evening, Zeke pulled a small recorder from his desk. "If we go," he said, "we go prepared. I'll keep this running. If something happens, the truth won't die with us." He also wrote a letter to my sister, sealing inside the whole truth about Isaiah and our fears about Darius. We lay awake that night, holding hands, whispering prayers. For the first time in 40 years of marriage, our anniversary wasn't about love or family. It was about survival. The morning of the trip, the sun rose bright and clear over Richmond, but for me, it might as well have been the darkest day of the year. I moved slowly through the house, brushing my hair, packing a small bag, each movement weighted with dread. I wasn't preparing for a celebration. I was preparing for the possibility of death. Darius showed up whistling, cheerful as though it were a picnic. "Morning, Mama, Daddy," he called, stepping through the door with a new hiking pack slung over his shoulder. Behind him, Monique appeared, radiant in a crisp windbreaker, carrying a camera around her neck. To anyone else, they would have looked like the perfect young couple, eager to honor their parents. But to me, they looked like wolves dressed for Sunday service. During breakfast, Darius spread a map across the table, pointing out the trail they planned to take. "It's easy, safe. Folks say the overlook has the best view of the whole valley," he explained. His voice was casual, but his eyes darted to Zeke and me, measuring, testing. I could hardly eat a bite. Zeke squeezed my hand under the table, a reminder that the recorder was already hidden and running. Our only shield was the truth we hoped to capture. As we loaded into the car, Monique hummed along with the radio, her laughter light and sweet. Yet every note tightened the knot in my stomach. Each mile that carried us closer to the mountains felt like a countdown. The drive to the mountains should have been beautiful. The leaves were blazing with autumn colors, the sky a clear Virginia blue, and the James River glistened as we crossed the bridge heading west. But for me, the beauty blurred into a haze. Every turn of the road felt like it was carrying us closer to the edge of something terrible. Darius drove carefully, almost too carefully. He obeyed every speed limit, stopped fully at every sign, his hands steady on the wheel. To anyone else, he might have looked like a responsible son taking his parents on a family trip. To me, he looked like a man making sure nothing interfered with his plan. Monique sat in the passenger seat, humming along to a gospel song playing on the radio. She snapped pictures out the window. Red barns, church steeples, the rolling Blue Ridge in the distance. "It's going to be such a special day," she said, turning to smile at me, "something we'll all treasure forever." Her words were syrupy sweet, but her eyes lingered just a moment too long, sharp and calculating. In the back seat, I squeezed Zeke's hand. He shifted slightly, tilting his body so that the small recorder hidden in his jacket pocket wouldn't be disturbed. We didn't dare speak of our fears out loud, but our silence was thick, heavy. At one point, Darius glanced at us in the rearview mirror. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "How you two holdin' up back there? Ready for an adventure?" I forced a nod. My voice caught in my throat, so I simply whispered, "Sure, baby." Every mile up that winding mountain road felt like a mile further from safety. When we finally pulled into the gravel lot at the trailhead, my stomach turned. The forest stood tall and quiet around us, the path stretching forward like an invitation we couldn't refuse. The trail began gently enough, winding between tall pines and moss-covered rocks. The morning air was crisp, the kind that should have refreshed me, but every breath felt heavy. I tried to match my steps to Zeke's, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot, willing myself to stay steady. Monique led the way, pausing often to snap photos of the scenery. "Look at these wildflowers, Mama," she called, pointing to a patch of yellow blossoms. Her voice rang bright, cheerful, like a daughter eager to share joy. But I knew better. Every smile, every picture was part of the performance. Darius stayed behind us, his footsteps deliberate, his presence pressing down like a shadow. "Y'all doing okay?" he asked every so often, his tone dripping with false concern. Each time I glanced back, his eyes were on us, not with love, but calculation, measuring distance, timing, waiting. The climb grew steeper, and soon Zeke's breathing turned labored. I could feel my own legs trembling with fatigue. We weren't hikers. We were 60-year-olds being led to exhaustion. "We're almost at the overlook," Monique announced, though the map had shown it was still a long way off. That lie confirmed what I already feared. They had no intention of taking us to the real overlook. They had chosen another place, one better suited for death. With every step forward, I felt it, the end drawing closer, disguised as a family outing. At last, the trees thinned, and we stepped into a clearing. Ahead, a jagged cliff jutted out over the valley, the James River glimmering faintly far below. It was the kind of view that might take your breath away, if your breath hadn't already been stolen by fear. Monique hurried to the edge, lifting her camera high. "This is perfect," she called out. "Mama, Daddy, come stand here. I want the valley behind you." Zeke and I moved cautiously, each step slow, deliberate. The wind whipped harder up here, tugging at my jacket, and I felt the emptiness yawning just behind my heels. Darius stepped in close, his voice smooth but tight. "A little further back, Mama. Just one more step and the picture will be perfect." I glanced at Zeke, and in his eyes I saw the same terror reflected in mine. He reached for my hand. Together we turned toward the camera, forcing smiles as Monique raised the lens. "Smile," she said, her tone dripping with something darker than sweetness. In that instant, Darius lunged. His hands pressed against our backs, the force undeniable. For a split second, it felt like time froze. The camera flashing, Zeke gripping my arm, my body teetering at the edge. And then the ground disappeared. We were falling. The drop felt endless, like time itself had unraveled. Wind whipped against my face. My scream trapped somewhere deep in my chest. The world spun in flashes. Blue sky, sharp rock, blurred treetops, until the earth rose up to meet us with a violent crash. The impact was like being struck by lightning. Pain erupted through my ribs. My shoulder twisted, and a metallic flood filled my mouth. For one terrifying moment, I thought the life had already drained out of me. Beside me, Zeke let out a guttural groan. His body was crumpled, his breath shallow, but he was still alive. I wanted to reach for him, but my limbs refused to obey. Then his voice came, thin and broken but steady enough to guide me. "Marcia, don't move. Play dead." Every instinct in me wanted to cry out, to cling to him, to fight against the agony, but something in his tone, desperate, commanding, stilled me. I forced myself into stillness, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the gray sky above. And then I heard them. Darius's ragged voice, Monique's pained moans. They had survived too. Through the ringing in my ears, I caught his words. "They're gone. Mama and Daddy. They're not breathing." A cruel relief laced Monique's reply. "Good. It worked. Now we just have to stick to the story." The world around me blurred with pain, but one thing cut through clear as glass. If I wanted even a chance at survival, silence was my only weapon. Through the haze of pain, I forced myself to stay limp, listening, Their voices echoed in the gorge, low and ragged, but laced with calculation. "We stick to the story," Darius muttered, coughing hard. I could hear him shifting, dragging his injured leg. Daddy slipped first, tried to grab Mama. We went after them. Nobody can prove different. Monique groaned, her tone sharp despite her own pain. "We've practiced this. Don't forget the details. You yell that you tried to save them. I cry for the cameras. And we both talk about how sudden it all was. Tragic. Believable." Darius let out a bitter laugh that made my stomach twist. "Once the police buy it, we get the house, the money, everything. Finally." "Just make sure you don't slip up," Monique snapped. "You almost ruined it bringing up Richard yesterday." My heart clenched at the sound of my firstborn's name, spoken like a shadow from the past. Richard, gone for 25 years, yet still tied to this darkness. "Don't worry," Darius said firmly. "Richard's gone. And now, so are they." Their words were poison, coating the air thicker than the smell of dirt and blood. Lying there, motionless, I felt the weight of betrayal heavier than my broken bones. My own son wasn't mourning me. He was rehearsing a script, and all I could do was play my part as the corpse they wanted me to be. When their voices finally faded into the distance, I let out the shallowest breath, my chest burning with the effort. Beside me, Zeke stirred, his face pale, his body twisted in ways that told me he was badly hurt. "Zeke," I whispered, barely moving my lips. He turned his head toward me, his eyes glassy but focused. "We're alive," he rasped, "but we gotta stay quiet. Let them believe we're gone." I nodded weakly, tears sliding into the dirt beneath my cheek. For a long moment, we just lay there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down. Then, as if something had been waiting inside him for decades, Zeke spoke again. "There's something I never told you about Richard." My stomach knotted. Even through the pain, his words cut sharper than broken bone. "That night, he died," Zeke whispered, his voice trembling. "I followed Darius, found him and Richard by the gorge, arguing. Richard had proof, bank slips, withdrawals. He knew Darius had been stealing from us. Said he was going to tell you." I shut my eyes, the truth hitting me like a second fall. "They fought," Zeke went on, tears spilling now. "And then—" Darius shoved him. "It wasn't no accident, Marcia. I saw it. Our boy killed his brother." The world tilted again, not from blood loss, but from the unbearable weight of betrayal. 25 years of silence, 25 years of lies, while I'd clung to the hope that Richard's death was fate, not fratricide. And now the nightmare had come full circle. The silence of the gorge pressed down on us after Darius and Monique's voices vanished into the distance. I lay motionless, blood sticky against my skin, the weight of Zeke's confessions still crushing my chest heavier than my broken ribs. Richard's face, his laugh, his warmth, flashed in my mind, now forever tied to the truth that his own brother had stolen his life. Zeke shifted weakly beside me, wincing. "We can't let them know," he whispered, his words barely a thread of sound. "If they find out we're alive, they'll finish it. We need to stay dead, until we can prove everything." I turned my head the slightest fraction, enough to meet his eyes. Even beaten, pale, and broken, there was fire in them. He was right. Survival wasn't about fighting back. Not yet. It was about patience, silence, and holding on to the evidence we could still gather. Above us, faint voices of hikers drifted in the wind, carried from the ridge. Help was close, but so was danger. If Darius or Monique reached them first, the story of our tragic accident would spread before we ever opened our mouths. I forced myself still again, every muscle screaming in rebellion. In that moment, I made a vow. If I lived through this, I would not carry silence for another 25 years. I had buried one son already. I would not bury the truth with him. The first sound of rescue came like a ghost through the trees, the rhythmic chop of helicopter blades slicing the air above the gorge. A voice carried faintly from the ridge, sharp and commanding, followed by the clinking of climbing gear against rock. "They're here," Zeke whispered, his voice hoarse. "Stay still, Marcia. No matter what, don't let them know yet." I forced myself to lie limp, my body screaming for relief. Each breath rattled like glass shards in my chest. Above us, Darius's voice rang out, cracked but deliberate. "Down here. Please, God, help us. My parents. They fell. Please, hurry." The desperation in his tone would have convinced anyone that he was the grieving son, not the predator. I wanted to scream, to rip away the mask he wore so well, but I bit it back. Playing dead was the only weapon I had left. Monique's sobs followed, perfectly timed, perfectly pitched. "It all happened so fast," she cried. "We tried to save them, but they were gone before we could do anything." Her performance was flawless. To the rescuers above, it must have sounded like the script of tragedy. To me, it was poison, rehearsed and polished over weeks of planning. Ropes dropped into the gorge, and boots thudded against the rock as paramedics and officers descended. One knelt beside me, pressing 2 fingers against my neck. His touch was clinical, searching for life. "She's barely holding on," he shouted upward. "Pulse is weak, but she's here. We need to stabilize and move fast." Inside, my heart pounded louder than the helicopter, but I kept my eyelids heavy, my breaths shallow. If Darius suspected for even a moment that I was conscious, he would find a way to silence me before the truth ever surfaced. Zeke's stretcher lifted first, his body strapped tight as medics worked frantically to steady him. Then they came for me, sliding supports under my frame, securing straps across my chest. As they hoisted me toward the waiting helicopter, Monique's wails echoed beneath, her words slicing through the roar of blades. They were the best parents. And now, they're gone. But I wasn't gone. And when the time came, her lies would collapse under the weight of the truth. The hospital lights were blinding when they wheeled me into the emergency ward. Machines beeped steadily around me, nurses moving with swift precision. I forced myself to remain limp, my eyes closed, though my mind raced faster than my pulse. "She's critical," one nurse reported. "Pulse weak, breathing shallow. Prep for observation." A doctor leaned over me, shining a light against my eyelids. I kept them still, praying he would mistake my willful silence for unconsciousness. But then a younger nurse, her name tag read Nia, paused longer than the others. I felt her hand linger against my wrist, her brow furrowed. "Doctor," she murmured, "her vitals don't match someone on the edge of death. There's strength here, more than we'd expect." The doctor shook his head. "Trauma does strange things. Monitor her closely. We'll reassess in an hour." When he left, Nia bent closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, if you can hear me, give me a sign. Anything." I hesitated, then let my finger twitch. Once, then twice. Her eyes widened, but she masked her reaction quickly, glancing at the monitors as if nothing had changed. "All right," she said softly, pretending to adjust the IV. "I believe you're in danger. Stay quiet. I'll make sure the right people know." Relief washed over me in a wave so strong, it almost broke my act. For the first time since the fall, I felt the stirrings of hope. Nia returned a short while later, this time with 2 men in plain clothes trailing just behind her. Their badges flashed briefly as she pulled the curtain around my bed. "Mrs. Johnson," one of them said in a low, steady voice, "I'm Detective Harris. Nurse Naya told us you may have important information. Are you able to speak?" I forced my eyes open, the harsh fluorescent light stinging. My throat felt raw, but the words scraped out anyway. My son and his wife. They pushed us. The detectives exchanged a quick glance. Nia squeezed my hand gently, urging me to go on. "They planned it," I whispered, every breath sharp with pain. "Not just today. 25 years ago, Richard. My oldest. Darius killed him. My husband saw it. We've lived with that lie all this time." Detective Harris leaned closer. "Do you have proof?" "Yes," I croaked. "Zeke recorded everything on his phone. Up on the mountain. Every word they said. It's all there." The second detective, a tall woman with sharp eyes, nodded firmly. "We'll secure the phone. Don't worry, ma'am. You're safe now. They won't touch you again." For the first time since the fall, my chest eased, even as pain throbbed through every bone. I had spoken the truth aloud. The secret buried for decades was finally in the open, and soon, the evidence would make it undeniable. Out in the waiting room, Darius and Monique played their roles to perfection. Monique clutched a tissue, dabbing at dry eyes as if tears had long since run out. Darius sat stiffly, his hands clasped tight, his voice breaking just enough when he spoke to the nurses. "They were the best parents," he said, shaking his head. "I still can't believe they're gone. We were just hiking, celebrating their anniversary. Then it all went wrong." A few nearby visitors murmured soft condolences, nodding with sympathy. To them, he looked like a son carrying unbearable grief. But just beyond the double doors, 2 detectives moved quietly into position. They had Zeke's phone now, its recordings pulled and secured. Every word, Monique's whisper about the plan, Darius's admission that they were gone, was crystal clear. Detective Harris entered the waiting area with a calm, deliberate step. His partner flanked him, her gaze fixed on the couple. "Darius Johnson, Monique Johnson," Harris said firmly, his voice cutting through the low hum of the room. "You are under arrest for the murder of Richard Johnson and the attempted murder of Marcia and Ezekiel Johnson." For a split second, silence hung heavy, then Monique gasped, clutching Darius's arm. "What? No, you've got it wrong. We're victims." Darius's face twisted, shock flashing into anger. "That's impossible. They're dead. We saw." He stopped, realizing too late what he had admitted. The detectives closed in, handcuffs snapping into place. The mask of grief slipped away, and the truth, ugly, undeniable, settled over the room. When Detective Harris stepped into my hospital room and told me the words, "They're in custody," I felt the air shift inside my chest, Relief and grief collided so sharply it nearly broke me. My son, my own flesh and blood, was in handcuffs for trying to kill me, and for killing Richard all those years ago. I turned my head toward Zeke's bed, his body still frail beneath the sheets, tubes running from his arms. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw the same storm I felt: sorrow, guilt, and a strange, painful kind of peace. "We did it," I whispered, though the words felt heavy. "The truth is finally out." But no victory could erase the image of Richard's smile, the sound of his laughter in our old kitchen, or the years stolen from him because his brother's greed outweighed his love. That loss carved deeper than any wound the fall had left on my body. I wept quietly, not just for Richard, not just for the betrayal of Darius, but for the family I thought we had, for the Sunday dinners, the laughter around the oak table, the dreams of grandchildren playing in the yard. All of it had been a house built on lies. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't carrying the secret alone. But the truth, though it freed me, cut deeper than the silence ever had. Later that afternoon, our longtime attorney, Mr. Coleman, arrived at the hospital with a stack of papers under his arm and a grave expression on his face. He pulled a chair close to my bed and lowered his voice. "Marcia, Zeke," he began, "I need you both to understand the weight of what's happening. The evidence from Zeke's phone is damning. Combined with your statements and what was overheard in the hospital, the prosecution has more than enough to pursue first-degree charges." My chest tightened. "First degree," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Yes," Mr. Coleman confirmed. "Darius is facing first-degree murder for Richard's death, and attempted first-degree murder for what happened on the mountain. Monique will likely face the same as an accomplice. At best, their lawyers will push for a plea bargain, but the recordings show premeditation. The odds are stacked against them." Zeke shifted painfully in his bed, his voice hoarse. "So, life in prison?" "Most likely," the attorney replied, "without parole." The words landed like stones. Life in prison. My son. The boy I had rocked to sleep. The child I once prayed over every night, now bound for a cell. And yet, deep inside, I knew there was no other way. He had chosen this path long before the mountain. When greed first sank its claws into him, Mr. Coleman set a gentle hand on mine. "Justice will come, Marcia. It's not the justice you ever wanted for your family, but it's the justice Richard deserves." I nodded faintly, my heart heavy with a truth I could no longer deny. Justice and heartbreak often walked hand in hand. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where truth was stripped bare. I sat at the witness stand, my hands trembling slightly as I swore to tell the truth. My voice cracked at first, but once I began, the words poured out. The fall, the lies, the years of silence surrounding Richard's death. Across the room, Darius sat in his suit, his wrists shackled beneath the table. For a fleeting moment, I searched his face for my son, the boy who once laughed on our porch, who begged for one more bedtime story. But what stared back at me was hollow. His eyes were flat, void of remorse, as if he had buried every trace of humanity long ago. When the prosecutor asked me what I felt that day on the cliff, I turned toward the jury, my throat tight. "Betrayal," I said, not just because my son tried to kill me, but because I realized he'd been killing this family piece by piece for 25 years. The room went still. For the first time, I felt my voice carry more than sorrow. It carried truth. Darius's lawyer leaned in to whisper something to him, but my son didn't flinch. He sat there, unblinking, almost bored, as if his fate wasn't hanging by a thread. That emptiness cut deeper than rage ever could. When I stepped down from the stand, I knew one thing for certain. The boy I had raised was gone, and the man sitting there was a stranger. The judge's gavel struck with a heavy finality, echoing through the courtroom like thunder. Darius Johnson and Monique Johnson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then whispers rippled across the benches. I sat frozen, my hands folded in my lap, trying to process the words. Justice had been served, yet my heart felt heavier than ever. No sentence could bring Richard back. No prison cell could erase the betrayal that had festered in my home for decades. And still, a truth settled over me like a quiet dawn. Secrets, when buried, only rot deeper. If Zeke hadn't pushed me to face the truth, if we hadn't clung to each other after the fall, Darius and Monique's lies might have lived on unchecked. I left the courthouse with my head bowed, but my resolve firm. My story wasn't just about survival. It was about facing the ugliest truths, no matter how much they hurt, because silence only feeds the darkness. And now I turn to you. If someone you love betrayed you in the most devastating way, would you have the strength to confront it? Would you choose truth, even knowing it could shatter everything? If this story gripped you, made you question, or even brought tears to your eyes, please comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support helps keep these truths alive, so none of us have to carry them in silence again.